Hello everyone, it's Spessy here, and today we're looking at the best decks in the Disney Lorcana metagame. We're quite far into set 4 Ursula's return, and at the weekend we have the first Disney Lorcana challenge for this set, which is in Chicago. So I thought now would be a really good time to take track of what the meta is looking like. I've got my 9 best decks. Now this is not to say that these are the 9 only good decks in the game. I do think that there's still a lot of experimentation ready to go, and there's definitely some dark horses that could potentially make a splash. And in today's video though, we're going to be looking at the decks which have had the best success in tournaments, rating them up from the S tier to the D tier. And we're going to start off today's video with Lemon and Lime, which is of course Amber and Emerald. Amber and Emerald started off the meta as a very popular pick with some really new interesting synergies with the new Under the Sea card as a Sing Together 8 card. Combining it with Kida, Protector of Atlantis, you can put a lot of cards from your opponent's side of the board onto the bottom of the deck. Also, with lots of discard tools, you can end up discarding your opponent's whole hand and then having control of the board. In previous sets, Ember and Emerald always had good ways of discarding the hand, but lacked a little bit of card draw as well as a little bit of board presence. But with Diablo as well as Under the Sea, both of these things have now been mitigated. While Lemon and Lime has still struggled a little bit, I wanted to highlight Andreas Koch's deck, which is utilizing Bucky instead of a more traditional approach. I think that Bucky is a very interesting card in a lot of different decks. Of course, Bucky has seen a lot of success and popularity when combined with Steel, but there's so many new Floodborns to test out, and Bucky into Diablo is just a really good option for many different ink color combinations. This deck is also utilizing the Muses, which is whenever you play a song, you may return a chosen character with 2 strength or less to their player's hand. So you can use the Muses to stall out your opponent, bouncing cards back into their hand, and then use Under the Sea to just put all of those cards at once onto the bottom of the deck. The Queen also gives you some interesting early game board presence, as well as painting the roses red to put up to 2 chosen characters with 1 less strength. Combining this card with the Muses as well as Under the Sea can be a really powerful combo. I do think that Lemon and Lime is a deck which has some potential for experimentation still, but at the moment it does seem like one of the weaker decks on this list. For that reason, I am going to put Lemon Lime into the D tier, but again, definitely one of these decks which is worth experimenting with a little bit more as time goes on. It could prove some people wrong. Certainly, if you're going to the Disney Lorcana Challenge in Chicago, I think there's a few of these decks which are going to be lower down, which could prove us wrong and really prove to be great in the current metagame. Up next, we've got BOOfasa, and yes, I'm going to continue to call it BOOfasa, but what I will say is I do like the look of BOOfasa a lot more in set 4 compared to set 3. In set 3, you had access to Ursula and Bare Necessities to discard Be Prepared, so the use case of BOOfasa previously in set 2 was that it was one of the only ways of dealing with Be Prepared. Be Prepared comes through, it removes your BOOfasa, but you still have cards on the board. Be Prepared isn't quite as much of a big threat, but the new Sisu card is. Sisu has very few counters in the game. Aerial, Treasure Collector is the obvious one which comes to mind, being a 3 strength character with ward, but if you want to play a different ink color combination, BOOfasa is definitely a good way of playing around Sisu to some degree. The Sisu can come through with a nice block to remove your BOOfasa, but potentially you hit something like a Maleficent Dragon to answer your opponent's Sisu instantly. Therefore, I do think that BOOfasa is a lot more of a reasonable option in the set 4 metagame compared with set 3. Of course, I'm aware that BOOfasa did win the Disney Lorcana Challenge out of nowhere, but this is going to be the Ruby Amber BOOfasa builds, which we're more used to seeing. There's definitely a lot of different ways you can go about building BOOfasa, but I think the main thing that you're going to be looking out for is minimizing the amount of non-character cards. The decks mainly are playing 4 copies or potentially 3 copies of Brawl, and you also might want to add in some Teeth and Ambitions to give yourself some more way of dealing with Diablo. One concern I do have for this deck is that a lot of Diablo decks are now playing the Cove location, which if Diablo is moved into, suddenly has 3 strength, and this deck is going to really struggle to deal with that Diablo. The other thing is, because the meta is quite greedy with decks like Ruby Sapphire, you do need to get some aggressive questing in with this Amber and Ruby deck. And I think Flynn Rider Frenemy is going to be the key to success. Flynn Rider on turn 2, followed by something like a Sisu on turn 3, can give you a lot of early lore gain, which then can help you close out the game later on. Of course, the new cards like Mulan and Beast Wounded synergize fantastically well with Rapunzel, and you also have access to the budget Rapunzel with Julieta Madrigal. Gaston and Doc are your main 2 ramp tools, which can help you get to these big characters like Lady Tremaine, Madame Medusa a little bit sooner, as well as Perdita being a very interesting option to pull back either Flynn Rider for that frenemy lore gain, for Mother Gothel for some Rapunzel synergy, or perhaps even Milan Injured Soldier to give yourself a great opportunity to easily shift in the Milan Elite Archer. The top end with these decks is more flexible. I think Surfer Stitch is definitely a card you're going to want to play, as well as a single copy of Chernabog, but you could also try to be a little bit more greedy and include some Maleficent Dragons for those ultimate Mufasa high rolls. My concern is that getting to 9 ink in this deck is going to be pretty tricky consistently, and so personally I would prefer more copies of Tremaine and Medusa rather than going big for the Maleficent Monstrous Dragon. Overall, I think BOOfasa is in a really interesting spot in this metagame and could prove to be pretty good. There's lots of different variations on the list that we're seeing. I do also want to give a dark horse mention to Ruby and Amber without Mufasa, but going down a more song-heavy route, maybe with Sleepy's Flute. BOOfasa does seem like the better approach though, just simply because it's a good answer to these Ruby and Sapphire Sisu decks. I'm going to go ahead and put BOOfasa into the C tier, but again, as a bit of a dark horse deck, I could see it improving a little bit. Personally though, I don't think it's going to be much better than the C tier. Up next, we have Ice Block Control, which I've already just alluded to there with the new Sisu card. It's taken the meta by storm. The biggest downside of a deck like this is having to play so many uninkables, but of course with Fishbone Quill, you can pretty much get away with that quite easily. This deck is just looking to ramp incredibly aggressively with 1 jump ahead on turn 2 into Fishbone Quill, or perhaps a 4-cost character like Flaversham or Grammartala into Singing How Far I'll Go the following turn. This allows you to play either Be Prepared or Sisu incredibly early, start gaining board control, and the longer the game goes on, the more difficult this deck is to deal with. The Ice Block is the new star of the show in this one. Of course, a great card with Flaversham, but also just an incredible tool to remove so many characters in the game with the Sisu card. Sisu Empowered Sibling is like a Be Prepared, which is also giving you board presence and questing potential. The main thing to consider with this deck is the ratios you're looking for with Lady Tremaine, Madame Medusa, Sisu, and Be Prepared. Personally, I think 4 copies of Madame Medusa and 4 copies of Sisu with those ice blocks is a must, and I've gone for 1 copy of Lady Tremaine as well as 1 copy of Be Prepared. This leaves us at 24 uninkables, which while very greedy, you should be able to get away with very careful mulliganing. I wouldn't be too surprised to see these decks include even more copies of Be Prepared moving forward, as well as Lady Tremaine, as these are 2 cards which are very good at dealing with Aerial Treasure Collector, which is kind of that anti-Sisu tech card, which a lot of Steel and Sapphire decks are going for. In my Steel Sapphire deck, I'm going to be sharing in a moment, I have 4 copies of Aerial Treasure Collector to try and play around that Sisu. But Lady Tremaine, maybe Bee King Undisputed, as well as Be Prepared are your best ways of dealing with that Aerial card. You could also consider including Judy Hopps as a way of dealing with Lucky Dime in the mirror matchups and against other Sapphire decks, as well as your best tool for item removal. Overall, in my opinion, if I had to pick one deck to say the best deck in the game, I would not hesitate to say that it's Ruby Sapphire Control. I think it just does everything really very well, has great matchups across the board, and it's really hard to go wrong with this deck unless you get your mulligan wrong and you end up bricking because of all the uninkables. It's an easy S tier deck for me, and in my opinion, it is the best deck in the game right now. Okay, up next we have Purple Steel, and there's many different ways you can go about building this deck. You might notice Yen Sid is the card that I've got on the image here, and that's because I really like the build with just a few magic brooms to give the deck a little bit more aggression. Of course, you could try Jafar, but Jafar doesn't really seem like the way to go at the moment, although it's definitely a dark horse contender in this metagame and one which could find its way through in Chicago. But you could also build the deck without Yen Sid. Now, you might be surprised to see Yen Sid in the deck, but just with a few brooms, you can get some really, really big value off of Yen Sid, drawing a card, questing for 3, and then being a really strong bounce target for your snakes and foxes to replay, drawing more cards and gaining you more lore. I think in this metagame, it's important to have an aggressive setup for Steel and Amethyst. And really the big reason I think that this deck has a lot of legs is because of the powerful 1-drop cards, as including Pascal, Magic Broom, and Chernabog's Followers. Chernabog's Followers and Magic Broom are very, very good against Bucky decks, but you also get access to removal tools like Baboom and Strength of a Raging Fire, which are of course great against Diablo. Added to that, you also get item removal with Benja, which also helps you quest aggressively, as well as the classic bounce package like Goats and Rabbits to close out the late game. There are only 8 brooms in this deck, and I have to say the 2-cost broom here is not exactly what you're going to be wanting to play, although it does give you some potential answers to Diablo, even if you don't have those babooms or Strength of a Raging Fires available, as it is gaining evasive during your turn. You could absolutely try this deck without the Yensid and without the 2-cost Magic Broom. Just include some more high-cost cards of your choice. Something like a Bell, which could synergize nicely with Mr. Smee, is an interesting possibility. As well as you could also try out LeFou, the new 3-cost character, which is going to be summoning itself if you remove something in a challenge this turn. Personally, though, I think you do want the aggression potential of Yensid on turn 2. Questing for 3 and drawing you a card is going to be really, really powerful against both Bucky decks and Ruby Sapphire decks, which are going to be dominating the metagame. You're only on 4 uninkables, so if there's any uninkables which you're a big fan of, you could also consider dropping some of the other cards to include some more uninkable cards of your choice. I do think with the Yensid setup, you're going to be wanting to mulligan very, very aggressively to try to find that Magic Broom on 1, Yensid on 2 opener, as well as then another Magic Broom on turn 3 for that 3 lore of Yensid. The ideal curve with this one is Magic Broom on turn 1, Yensid on turn 2, into another 1-cost Magic Broom on 3, and a Madam Mim Snake to bounce back Yensid on turn 3 as well. This gives you lots of lore, a wide board, as well as lots of card draw potential as well. I really think this is the biggest Dark Horse deck of the metagame, and I think that it's actually going to be a lot better than people realize. Now, my instinct tells me that this is actually going to be an A tier deck, but because it's quite untested, even by myself to this point, I am going to put it in the B tier, but it's my top contender for biggest Dark Horse of the metagame. I think this deck's just got a lot of legs. I think that the steel removal with Babooms and Benja pairs really nicely with the aggressive bounce potential of Amethyst, and I do think that this is going to be a really, really strong deck into a lot of the top meta decks. But I'm going to put it in B tier for now. Absolutely a deck to keep an eye on in Chicago. I would be surprised if we don't see some Amethyst Steel decks doing really well this weekend. Up next, the old faithful Ruby Amethyst, and this deck just continues to somehow survive when it's been written off every single time. Really strong performance this weekend at the PAC tournament. Also in my games at UK Games Expo, Ruby Amethyst caused me a lot of problems as a Sapphire Steel player. While Ruby Amethyst didn't seemingly get many new tools, Flynn Rider Frenemy is a really interesting card in this metagame, able to get you lots of lore very early on. Flynn on 2 into Sisu on turn 3 is what this deck is looking to do, to be racking up lore very, very quickly, and then of course the potential to close the game out with goats. Queen's Castle is still an absolute money card in this deck as well. Many of the top meta decks are really struggling to deal with Queen's Castle. So a Flynn on 2, a Sisu on 3 into Queen's Castle on 4, when going first especially, is an incredibly difficult opener for most decks to deal with. King Undisputed is also a menace in this deck. You could play 3 copies. I've gone for 4 though, because being able to sing it with both your goats and rabbits is so powerful and is so strong into these very aggressive Sapphire decks, which like to play Aerial on an open board, which might like to play a Sisu on an open board as well. In fact, the one game I lost on the main event I played in on Friday was to Ruby Amethyst, because I played Aerial into King Undisputed with a Queen's Castle down on the board, and I just was not able to catch up from that point. You could absolutely look at playing some Lady Tremaines as well. Dolores Madrigal is a new interesting option to give yourself some card draw. The 1-cost cards are quite flexible. You might want to consider playing a few more, like Pascal could be an interesting option as well. But I think Chernobogs and Magic Broom give you an interesting chance to deal with Bucky. Speaking of Bucky, that is the big problem for this deck. While it has really strong matchups across the board, it has an absolutely horrendous matchup into Bucky. And the big question really for this deck is, should you try to tech for Bucky with cards like Teeth and Ambitions potentially to deal with the Diablo more consistently rather than just relying on the Brawl? Or should you just accept your fate, accept that you're bad into Bucky, play the deck to be beating other decks? If you just want to accept that you're bad into Bucky, you could play more copies of Be Prepared, maybe more copies of Sisu. However, if you want to be teching for Bucky, it's very unlikely you're getting to 7 ink, and having this Be Prepared in hand gives your opponent a free opportunity to discard it with Ursula Deceiver. So the big question for this deck really is, can it be teched enough to deal with Bucky, or do you have to just accept that you have a horrendous Bucky matchup? If it wasn't for Bucky, this would be absolutely actually right up in the S tier, but because it has such a tricky time into Bucky, which is of course probably the most popular deck in the current metagame, it's impossible to put Ruby Amethyst any higher than the A tier. All the decks in the S tier are going to have solid matchups across the board, whereas Ruby Amethyst really struggles against Bucky. It is a miserable experience as a Ruby Amethyst player when you queue into Bucky. However, maybe the decks can be teched enough to deal with it, and if it can, it is definitely one which could creep up into the S tier. Up next, we have Sapphire Steel, which is a deck which I've been playing a lot of. I think it's an incredible deck into the metagame, has strong matchups into Bucky as well as Ruby Sapphire control. The star of the show in this deck is without doubt Aerial Treasure Collector. In fact, it's the reason that I have even played Sapphire Steel in the first place. With how strong Ruby and Sapphire is, I just wanted to find a card which was a little bit anti-Sisu. Of course, there's BOOfasa, which you guys know I've never been the biggest fan of, but Aerial Treasure Collector, with her 3 strength and ward, stands out like a sore thumb. I had multiple players this weekend trying to ice block Sisu my Aerial, but of course with her ward that is not possible. And with the Lucky Dime, you can tap the dime for 5 lore onto Aerial, quest for another 5, tap the dime the next turn, and that's 15 lore in a single turn. Well, 15 lore in 2 turns if your opponent is unable to answer your Aerial. She's an absolute menace. Tamatoa So Shiny is also just a really good top end tool in this one to be able to just gain insane lore off of a Lucky Dime in a single turn. Often a Tamatoa, you're going to have 7 to 8 items down, so you can get up to 8 or 9 lore in a single quest with Tamatoa. So the Lucky Dime is great up against the Ruby Sapphire decks, but then against Bucky, you have 4 Babooms as well as Fire the Cannons and 4 copies of Grab Your Swords to deal with the Diablos and Buckys. You also have 4 copies of Tinkerbell, which you can play on turn 4 if you play the Fishbone Quill down on turn 3. Big shout out to Avalanche as well, which is definitely a card I would consider increasing the count of up to 2 copies. It's great at dealing with Queen's Castle as well as the new Cove location, which a lot of the Emerald Steel players are playing. Avalanche can remove that Cove location and it damages Bucky by 1. Bucky's also going to lose that protection it has if it's in the Cove, so you can use Avalanche to remove Bucky in a single swoop, even if it is in the Cove. And with the popularity of that location as well as Ruby Amethyst increasing its meta share, I do think that Avalanche is a really interesting card for this deck. Potentially you just reduce the count of Grab Your Swords to increase the count of Avalanche. I'm also playing 3 copies of Beast Hard-Headed, just a solid option as a 5-cost character, which can sing both Whole New World and Grab Your Swords, but of course it's also just really nice in mirror matchups, removing your opponent's Fishbone Quill, and it can also help you have that extra item compared to your opponent to get your Aerial Treasure Collector questing for 5. Pretty heavy on the uninkable count here at 21, and of course this deck can absolutely brick. If you don't find the Fishbone Quill, the Mickey Mouse often feels a little bit too slow, but Mickey Mouse can also be a great deterrent of playing around Beaking, Undisputed, and Lady Tremaine when up against Ruby Amethyst players. There's definitely some flexibility in this list, but I would strongly recommend that you play heavy on the Aerials as well as the Tamatoas and just try to control the board while then using Lucky Dime to finish off the game. Sapphire Steel is a deck which is kind of hovering between the A tier and the S tier, but I am going to go ahead and put it into the S tier because it just has solid matchups across the board. Unlike Ruby Amethyst, which has that one really bad matchup into Bucky, I think Sapphire Steel is great into all of the meta decks here. Admittedly, Ruby Amethyst can certainly cause it some problems with Beaking Undisputed, but Sapphire Steel has lots of ways of dealing with that Flynn Rider with Fire the Cannons, with Baboom. As long as you can remove that Flynn Rider and prevent it from gaining lots of lore early on, you should be good to go in that matchup overall. Up next, we have Amber Steel Songs, an ever-present deck similar to Ruby Amethyst. Definitely one to keep an eye on because I do think it's a little bit underexplored. I think the list is going to look pretty similar to previous metagames, with Aerial Sonic Warrior being a new interesting introduction. Whenever you play a song, you may pay 2 ink to deal 3 damage to chosen character. I also want to give a mention to Philo here, who is potentially a way of gaining lots of lore quite quickly, and I could see the deck upping the count of him and playing more heroes. Whenever you play a hero character, gain 1 lore. Certainly an interesting option. Bare Necessities as well as Sleepy's Flute give you lots of good ways of dealing with your opponent's cards. I think Bare Necessities in particular, denying the Fishbone Quill with a Cinderella, is going to be really good against those Sapphire decks, and Sleepy's Flute is just going to help you rack up that lore as well. Definitely lots of experimentation still to be done with Sapphire Steel. We know these lists are very tight often, and I do think that in order to sort of in order to survive in the current metagame, it is going to have to be quite aggressive. Similar to what we saw with Frank Carston's list, maybe we could see Piglet Pooh Pirate Captain being the way to go in this one as well. But I do think Sleepy's Foot is just looking like a really solid option against those Ruby Sapphire decks in particular. Perhaps this deck could also make use of Avalanche, which unfortunately is not a song, because it can potentially struggle to deal with locations, although And Then Along Came Zeus is definitely an option that you have here. Could also, of course, play the big Cinderella, which can be a bit of a menace for a lot of players to deal with. Overall, though, I don't think Songs looks great. I think the meta is a little bit too greedy with these Ruby and Sapphire decks, and Songs really tends to struggle against those a little bit. Song's worst matchup in set 3 was Ruby Sapphire, and Ruby Sapphire is more popular than ever. I'm going to go ahead and put Songs into the D tier. I don't think it's the right metagame for Songs, but perhaps Amber Steel can be built more aggressively and give it some better matchups into the top meta decks, and it could definitely be one to keep an eye out for as the meta settles a bit more. I do think a lot of these decks in the lower tiers are underexplored still to this point. Oh boy, it's Bucky. Remember when I said that Diablo was the most overrated card in the set? Well, I think it's fair to say I got that wrong. The synergy with Diablo and Bucky is absolutely insane. Your one-cost Diablo is able to check to see if your opponent has any answers in their hand, and if they don't, you can safely then shift the Diablo on turn 2 alongside your Bucky, maybe singing a song like Strength of a Raging Fire or the Storm Rage on, or simply just questing for 2. The new card is the Hidden Cove, which these decks are really making use of, which is characters here get 1 strength, but more importantly, 1 extra willpower while here. This is putting your Bucky to 2 willpower, your Diablo to 3 willpower, and that is just absolutely disgusting against a lot of the decks which are teched to remove your Bucky and Diablo with cards like Tinkerbell or cards like Baboom. Suddenly, your Diablo is safe from that. Obviously, a lot of Floodborns with the Robin Hood, Pegasus being the 1-drop options, as well as the Pegasus Robin Hood shift targets. Also, a few copies of Beast and Tinkerbell. The new Aladdin is, of course, a Floodborn itself, as well as Jafar. You really just can't go wrong with this deck. 2 copies of Grab Swords, 3 copies of Bruno. This is Jordan Bashi's list, which won the big online pack tournament the other day, and I think it's really hard to go wrong with this deck. I will say that I think that Bucky is not quite as good as people are giving it credit for. I think it's got unfavorable matchups into Ruby Sapphire, as well as the Sapphire Steel decks. Unsurprisingly, Bucky is going to be going into the S tier. The question is, where is it going to go? I've already told you that I think that the best deck in the format currently is Ruby Sapphire. So do I think that Bucky is better than Sapphire Steel? And I actually don't, this is definitely a hot take. I think Sapphire Steel could have even been going into the A tier, but having played a lot of Sapphire Steel, I just think it's a really, really strong deck. I was able to play against Jan Moyen in person at the weekend in a 8-player constructed in the finals, and I was able to come out with a 2-1 very close win against Bucky Floodborn, although I think Jan would argue that his deck wasn't super optimized. It was definitely a close matchup, but I do think Sapphire Steel just about edge those matchups. And overall, I think that Bucky is very, very strong, but of course the meta is so teched towards it. This was kind of my feeling with Diablo. Diablo is always a strong card, but the meta is teched to deal with it, and therefore it might prove to be a little bit underwhelming. I definitely got that wrong, but I do think because the meta is so teched for Bucky that it's not quite up as... I wouldn't put it quite as high up as the other two. It's very, very tight between all 3 of these decks in the S tier, and they're all amazing options, but for me, personally, I would not be playing Bucky. I just think that if I'm playing a deck in Chicago this weekend, for example, I'm playing a deck which can beat Bucky very reliably, or I'm not bothering with it. So, personally, I don't think Bucky is quite as good as the other 2, but it's very, very close indeed. And I think most people would argue something like this is more reasonable, but I've just got a real soft spot for Sapphire Steel at the moment. I think it's just really, really good in the current metagame. Finally, last but certainly not least, we have Tempo, which is Emerald and Amethyst, a deck which I've really liked the look of for a long time and haven't really had a chance to experiment with yet myself. Because I haven't had a real chance to experiment with it myself, I'm showing Bennett Cole's deck, who got top 64 in the pack at the weekend, which is also utilizing the 1-cost Diablo, the 3-cost Diablo, but instead of Bucky going for a blue fairy. Now, of course, Ursula Sea Witch Queen is a really interesting option in this deck as well, being able to shift it onto your 2-cost Ursula Deceiver. Queen's Castle, not in this list, which I do find a little bit surprising. I think that Amethyst really likes to utilize Queen's Castle as much as possible. Ursula Deceiver of all, also of course a good combination with friends on the other side. Definitely a deck which is one worth experimenting with a little bit more. I do think that the color combination has some legs. Overall, I think that Emerald has a lot of decks which are unexplored, which aren't utilizing the Steel combination, and I do think that even Bucky is a reasonable and interesting option for these decks, but instead in this one, Bennett going for the blue fairy. Definitely a deck to keep an eye on as things continue to develop. I think it's got a lot of potential still. I am going to put tempo up into, I'm torn between the C tier or the D tier. I think I'm going to go ahead and put it into the C tier alongside BOOfasa. I think maybe you could even argue that BOOfasa deserves to go into the B tier as well, because I really don't think it's bad. But I'm going to go ahead and put this into the C tier. I think that, as I mentioned earlier, I think Amethyst Steel is a deck I've got a lot of hope for, and I think could really, really push these top decks, whereas I'm not convinced that these quite have the legs. Again, I think there's a lot of experimentation to be still done in the meta. I think there's a lot of Dark Horse decks. I think all these decks in B tier or below are absolutely have potential to increase where they stand once people have built them a little bit more differently. But all of these decks need to be built in a way to deal with what is in the top, because these 4 decks at the top are going to have a large share of the meta. I expect Amethyst Steel to make a real splash quite soon. And then maybe these decks down below could prove us wrong. There's also some other decks which I haven't mentioned, which are, of course, worth considering. Decks like Jafar could make a comeback. I think that Ruby and Emerald as a color combination has still got potential, but maybe it's just needing to speed up a little bit because of the popularity of control decks. I think Bucky decks are absolutely something which are worth experimenting with a little bit more outside of just Steel as well. This is my impression on the metagame going into Chicago. Of course, after Chicago, there's going to be another one of these where we have a much clearer idea on exactly what decks are performing really well, because players are going to be hiding their secret decks that they've been building and bringing them to Chicago. I'm super excited. I am going to be doing a watch party of the Chicago event on the channel, so make sure you subscribe for that and look out for it. We're going to be watching that together. Should be a lot of fun. Really excited to see which deck comes out on top. If I had to pick a winner, my prediction would be that Sapphire Steel will come out on top, but I would also love to see something a little bit surprising, perhaps like an Amethyst Steel or an Emerald Amethyst as well. Let's just hope it's not Bucky or Ruby Sapphire Control. I think that if neither of those win, I'm going to be happy. Thanks so much for watching the video. Give it a like if you enjoyed. I'm making sure my mic wasn't muted for the whole time I'm recording. Thank goodness it wasn't, but my mic was a little bit quieter than it should have been. Never mind. Thanks again, and see you all very, very soon. Cheers.